Duncan, because that's why everyone's here. Off you go, Finn. Sorry about
All
that.
right. No worries, no worries. It happens, right? So you can hear me okay now, though, right?
That is loads better. Yes, thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, I gave it a little gain on the mic there. Okay, so as I was saying, Cyber Speaks Live, we get some great co-hosts on there for each episode. I'm talking folks like Troy Hunt from Have I Been Pwned, Caitlin Bowden from the Badass Army, Ann Johnson, gosh, the corporate vice president of cybersecurity with Microsoft. Marcus J. Carey, if you guys are familiar with the Tribe of Hackers book series and the summit, he's the founder of that whole movement there. And by the way, speaking of the Tribe of Hackers, the Blue Team edition of that book series is dropping on the 16th of this month. I am so honored and just grateful to be one of the co-authors of that. So if you haven't already, check it out on Amazon or whatever book source you use, and go ahead and pre-order that. It's just a phenomenal series. But the other role that I host and play is what we're here for today, and that's being the founder and CEO of Operandus, where I get to work with some of the cybersecurity industry's most recognizable brands, helping them to create compelling technical content for their audiences, as well as doing some or conducting some pretty insightful competitive analysis engagements for their internal teams. So that's what I do on a day-to-day basis when I'm not sitting here on a Saturday doing these kinds of things. So with that, this talk is actually night and day from David. So he had 90 slides there, and you saw my one slide. So I'm going to be basically just playing off of my notes here and shooting from the hip. I hope nobody minds that, but enough of the PowerPoint stuff. You guys have my video okay?
Yep, looks great. Really good.
Perfect. All right. So that being said, it's really hard for me to get into the subject of today's talk about, going from basically a GED, and in case that doesn't translate well into the UK, I don't know, but basically a general equivalency diploma. How I went from being, a high school dropout with a GED to becoming the CEO of my own company in, the cyberspace. I really can't do that without giving a little bit of background on essentially why I didn't graduate high school to begin with, and some of the effects that had on me in my development years and early adulthood. So forgive me, but I'm going to give you a little bit of background on me, and this might get a little bit deep emotionally. So trigger warning for any of you that might relate to some of this. I'm going to talk about some core issues at the heart. I had a pretty rough upbringing. I didn't come into cyber like most people that, graduate high school, go off to a 4-year university, graduate from that, and, maybe they interned during their summer months and, just landed into a job and went through the career development process from there. My life had a much different set of circumstances, so to speak. So my mother was a 12-year-old runaway and met my father when she was 15, got married, had me at 16, and he was a very abusive alcoholic and put my mother into the hospital a couple times. And after that second time, she left him, took me, and we left Mississippi where they were and went back to New Hampshire where my grandparents were and started over. That experience and growing up without a father played tricks with me. It weighed real heavily on me, and especially around the age of 5 and kindergarten and starting into school, I started to see that I was different than the other kids there. This was the early 70s, and it wasn't acceptable back then to come from a broken home. It wasn't acceptable back then to be a single mother raising children. Divorce wasn't as commonplace as it is today. And women that did divorce their husbands were frowned upon. And as a child of a broken home, I was looked at differently. I wasn't good enough. Same kind of thing played out in my head with my own father. And, as much as he was an asshole and someone I didn't need in my life, I still wanted that fatherhood. I wanted that relationship. And it didn't matter, um, when every birthday, Christmas, New Year's, it didn't matter. Any holiday kind of brought those feelings back up. And, looking for that birthday card in the mail or a Christmas present, or for him to show up on the doorstep, wanting to be a father in my life, it never happened. And it started making me feel like there was something wrong with me, that if my own father couldn't love me, if he didn't want to be a part of my life, there must be something wrong with me. Right. And that weighed real heavily on my mind and started to affect the person that I was becoming. And by the time I was in my early teens, I started acting out, and I got involved in drugs. I got involved in alcohol. I was partying all the time, having sex way too young, getting in trouble with law enforcement, uh, skipping school, getting arrested, you name it. I was putting my mother through a living hell, to the point that she ended up shipping me down to my father when I was 13 years old. And that didn't last very long. He ended up beating the hell out of me. And, well, I had to be immediately sent back home to my mother, where things just continued to get worse and worse. Um, Along the way, um, my arrest history started to get much more severe and getting into trouble, but I always seemed to manipulate the probation officers, the courts, the prosecutors, and would have continued sentence after continued sentence, longer probation, these kinds of things, but never really doing the jail time itself. But um, fast forward probably into 15 years old, I ended up working at this restaurant and had a friend that was there. He introduced me to this cop that would come in very regularly, and got to know him pretty well, at least, from a customer perspective. We would sit there and chit chat and whatnot. And one evening he comes in with his partner, and they sit down, have dinner. I wait on them, doing a little chit chat like we normally do. They leave, and afterwards, my manager comes up to me, grabs me by the hand, and says, "Come on, I need to talk to you outside." And we start walking towards the front door, and I'm wondering what the hell's going on. Well, I go out there, and there's my, police officer friend, Dave Reagan, and his partner that I just waited on. And he looks at me and says, "Son, sometimes there's things that we have to do in this job that we don't like, and this is one of them." He said, "I have 4 warrants out for your arrest. Don't run." Apparently, he knew my track record and knew that I like to run from law enforcement. I told him I won't, Dave. And he said something to his partner that walked back inside the restaurant, and he and I got into that car. He starts taking me to jail and decides to pull off on the side of the road. Puts the car into park, opens up the slider to the back, and he looks back at me. He says, "Son, what the hell is going on with you?" I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "What's going on? Why are you doing these things?" And I told him, "Dave, just put the car in drive. Let's go." He says, "No, we're not moving until you tell me what the hell is going on in your life, why you're doing these things, why you're ruining your life and taking your mother down with you." And I don't know what it is about that man or that moment, but for some reason, all my guards just came down. I wasn't being that hard ass anymore. I just became vulnerable and I lost it. I was crying uncontrollably and I let it all out, put it all out on the table. And I don't know how long we were actually there, but we were there a good long while. I wish I could say that Dave took me home and slapped me on the wrist and everything was fine from there. He took me to jail. And unlike every other time, my mother didn't get me out. She left me there this time. And I spent a couple weeks in juvenile detention where I spent about 22 hours a day in my cell, only came out for meals. And finally, my court date comes and I'm looking at all these charges, not just the 4 that I was arrested for, but all the other ones that had suspended sentences. And I go into the courtroom and in walks Dave Reagan, that police officer, and his 8-month pregnant wife. And he asked to speak to the judge on my behalf. Had it not been for that man and for that moment of being vulnerable and just breaking down and putting everything out there, that man, he saved my life. Or he at least put it on a different trajectory than what was in store for me. It's very likely that I'd be in prison or dead right now if it wasn't for that man and him taking a chance on me. So, lesson 1, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to let others in and tell them you're not doing okay. You know, there's a lot of things that we go through in life and in this career that are challenging, and it's okay to be vulnerable. Um, Good things can come from it. It did for me. So I end up becoming a ward of the state. Um, my mother, she couldn't put up with me anymore. I was too much for her and put her through way too much hell. So basically, I flip flop between foster homes and group homes for the next couple of years, and as I'm approaching 18, it is required of me to take GED preparation courses because I was a dropout. Um, that's a whole nother story. But basically, in order for me to drop out at 15, I had to get by the probation officer, I had to have 3 letters, one from my school saying it was okay, one from my employer, and one from my mother. Now, the employer was no problem. I got that one, just lied to him, told him a bullshit story, and they gave me the letter. The school, that was an interesting one. I walk into the principal's office, tell him what I wanted to do, and he looks at me, Butch Garrett. I still can't stand the guy. And you'll know why here in just a second. But he looks at me and he says, let me tell you something, boy. You want to come to school, fine. You don't, fine. I'm tired of fucking with you. His words, not mine. So, yeah, I got the letter from the school. The one from my mother, that one broke me. Um, when she signed off on that letter, she basically was writing me off, and I knew it. And I can't blame her. She did the very best she could with me, but I was too much. And when she wrote that letter, it kind of told me, I'm done. This is it. She's given up. I'm not good enough. Not good enough for my father. I'm not good enough for my mother. Not good enough for the school. We moved around all over the country. I never had friends, anything like that. I wasn't good enough. I didn't sound like them. I didn't look like them. Everything in my life at that point was telling me I wasn't good enough. But remember, Dave Reagan took that chance. He told me I was good enough, that I had a future. I had an opportunity to make something of myself. So I do the GED preparation course, and right after my 18th birthday, you had to be 18 in order to take it back then in the state of Tennessee. I think there's no way that I've passed this thing. I didn't have the confidence going in. And the whole time taking the exam, I'm thinking, there's no way. I'm not good enough. I don't know this stuff. It's too much. I should have stayed in school. I'm going to be washing dishes for the rest of my life. Few weeks go by and I get the package in the mail, big manila envelope, and I open it up and there's a letter congratulating me on passing it along with my certificate that I still have to this day. Um, so I passed my GED, and that's essentially how I got to not finishing high school to begin with. Sorry for that background, but I think it's applicable to some other things that happened later in my career. So I'm 18. A couple years go by. I'm 19. I meet a young lady and fall in love, and she ends up eventually becoming my wife. But we ended up co-workers together working for this company, and we had some really great benefits there. And one of those was access to a credit union, and um, I convinced her to let me take out an $1,800 loan to go buy a brand new computer and printer. And I told her I'm going to make money off of this. Now, part of what incited me to go out and spend that kind of money on a brand new computer and take out a loan to do it was the other fringe benefit of this company is that they had a relationship with the local community college that they would bring college professors on site to teach credit courses at our facilities. And if we took those courses and maintain a uh, C average or above, they would pay everything up front. You only had to pay if you fell below that C average or you didn't finish the course. So here, being this, GED high school dropout, I have an opportunity to get some college credit. Now, the three courses that they offered initially were Psych 101, DOS 3.0, and Lotus 123. I took all three. I wanted to max out. Now, I'd already got married at this point. We're still working together, and we're pregnant with our first daughter. In the psych class, we kind of became the case study, so to speak, for family psychology. We were just the model, working together, married, having our first child, all that stuff. The DOS class, I loved. I absolutely fell in love with the DOS operating system. I don't know why, but it just intrigued me. The Lotus 123, I'm not a spreadsheet guy. I could have taken that or left it, but I did maintain a 4.0 for all three of those classes. And it really got me moving. So she agreed to let me get this $1,800 computer and printer. The brand name was Leading Edge. It was a 486 SLC, and it was badass for what computers were back then. But one of the guys that I met in the DOS class that I worked with, obviously, he and I started chit chatting about stuff, and he told me about these BBSs, bulletin board systems back then. Well, I didn't have a modem, so a couple of weeks go by. He comes in and he hands me this card that goes inside of the computer, and he tells me, "Here, you can have this. Use it to get online." And he tells me it's a 2400 baud modem that he doesn't need anymore. He just upgraded. I'm like, cool. So I run home. I take this thing apart, and I'm figuring out how to drop this card in there and make all this stuff work. And for the next 2 or 3 weeks, I'm just beating my head against a wall, pounding the keyboard, trying to figure out how the hell I get this damn modem to connect. I can't do it to save my life. And back then, we didn't have Google. We didn't have, computer books, filling the shelves of bookstores. Magazines, they weren't really prescriptive or guiding in these kinds of things. So I'm sitting there on my own trying to figure this shit out, and nothing's working. No matter what I do, I can't figure it out. I can't get this damn card to work. So eventually I tap out. I go back to Arthur, the guy who gave it to me, and I said, "Look, man, I can't get this to work." He says, "What's going on?" I said, "Nothing. Nothing at all. It will not do anything." He says, all right, I'll come over and help you. So he does. And in less than an hour, we have this thing working. I didn't know anything about jumpers. I didn't know anything about IRQs. I didn't know anything about high mem, all this stuff. We sit there, tweak a couple things, and I get that very familiar sound that I'm sure you guys know, that squelching modem connecting. And I get my first glimpse at a BBS, a bulletin board system. And I fall absolutely in love with it, to the point that within just a few months, I decide I'm tired of just calling into other people's BBSs. I want to run one. So I go out and I get Wildcat 3.0 and I start building my BBS. And before long, I'm dropping in a RoboBoard. I'm adding a 20 meg hard drive. I'm upgrading the RAM. I'm doing all this stuff. And I end up building one of the largest bulletin board systems in the state of Tennessee. I was having FidoNet email back in 1993. That was like the first version of internet email. It was one of those things, if you've never been on a BBS or never been a sysop, that's being a BBS sysop, system operator. It is just like being on the front lines of a help desk. You have to learn how to support your users. You have to not only support your own users, but you're likely working with other BBS sysops and helping them. They're helping you. The FidoNet network, you're having to deal with other nodes on that network that are up the chain, so to speak. So that really got me even further inspired and wanting to make a career or do something with it. It was a hobby still, but I was so enthralled with everything. But now I'm turning 21. I already have one daughter. I have another one on the way, and I turned 21, and it's time to pay Dave Reagan back for what he did for me. And I go into law enforcement. Now, while I was a police officer, one of the detectives came up to me one day and she asked, "What do you know about the World Wide Web?" Apparently, word got around that I was into computers. I said, "I know a little bit." I really didn't. It's just getting out there. And she said, "Do you think you would be able to help us create a web page on the World Wide Web?" That's what they still called it back then, that or the information superhighway. "We want a web page for rape awareness and prevention." She was with the sex crimes unit. I said, "Yeah, let me see what I can do." So using the Mosaic browser and trying to figure out HTML 1.0, I'm looking at other web pages and viewing the source on those and kind of looking at it side by side and seeing, how these paragraphs are structured, how the bolding works, how headers are working, links and images and all this stuff. And I'm basically reverse engineering the HTML 1.0 language and trying to teach myself how to program so I can write this web page for them. And I do. There's nothing wrong with reverse engineering other people's work so that you can build your skill sets. There's nothing wrong with looking at scripts or application code and teaching yourself from what others have already created. It's a great way to be able to build your skill sets and build off of what others have already done out there. Now, I'm running the BBS. I'm still in law enforcement, and I decide I want a little bit more. So I go back to Columbia State Community College and I sign up for a Novell Network and 2.2 course and Intro to Programming, Logic, and Design. Now, that last one there, I still use those skills to this day for scripting, programming, writing code. That was just a phenomenal course using the hypo language, which doesn't even exist. It was hypothetical. It was a machine level programming language that the university wrote. But it taught me how to think logically when it comes to programming or scripting. And that skill set, you'll find out, came into extreme use later on in my career. But now I'm really starting to build some foundation. And the reason I left law enforcement is at the time, the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department and our division within it was caught up in a lot of politics. And unfortunately, it cost 2 officers their lives. And it's a long story. But at that funeral, there in my dress blues, I started thinking to myself, this is not what I want for my daughters. I had 2 of my 3 children at that point, and I didn't want them to grow up fatherless like I had. I didn't want them to have something like that funeral uh, be their last memory of me. So I decided I'm going to leave law enforcement and I'm going to make a career out of my hobby. And I did. The first job that I took was working for a break fix company. Basically, we had small businesses that we supported from an IT perspective, and they would have anywhere between, say, 5 and 50 at most computers in their environment. Some of them had Novell networks, which that course obviously helped me out with. But it was break fix kind of work, swapping out memory, upgrading hard drives, replacing monitors, that kind of, bollocks. But it gave me a lot of foundational skills that I needed. And after about 6 months, I went to work for a bank that was headquartered there in Nashville, a little regional bank, but very well known throughout the Southeast region. And I went in there as a contractor, um, working for a third party, kind of like the break fix company, where they owned the PC support contract for that bank. And they kind of paid us, I would say, decent. It wasn't on par, but it was enough. I went in making 28,000 a year, and I thought that was pretty good money for, essentially a high school dropout. And this is around 95. And I go in and very quickly start to see the writing on the wall. And this is another lesson. Look for changes in the marketplace. Look for those things that are signals, the writing on the wall, so to speak. But we were a Novell shop. We were running CC mail and a bunch of archaic stuff. But I could see that we were implementing more and more Microsoft-based technologies. So I started focusing on those. Windows 351, Windows NT 351, Windows NT 4.0, SQL Server, Exchange, Windows 95. And I started to carve out a role for myself within the organization focused on those technologies. And as the bank decides they're going to do this forklift migration, essentially taking every product that competed with Microsoft, they were getting rid of. So we were flipping from Novell to Windows NT Network, and we were going from CC Mail to Exchange, from flat databases, DB2 and stuff, to SQL Server. Going from down level versions of Windows, Windows 3.1, 3.1.1, Windows for Workgroups. We were going to Windows 95. We were getting rid of Lotus Notes and going to Office. So I really focused on those and built a role for myself. And before long, the bank hired me on as a full-time employee, and I got a nice little bump in salary as a result. I think at that point I went to 36K. Now I'm bawling, right? I am elated with myself. Remember, I'm still just a high school dropout. And anyhow, while I'm there, I'm trying to figure out how can we automate this. So I start looking at now. I'm responsible for this migration team that's handling the Windows 95 deployment, Office, and Internet Explorer. Those were the three things that we were primarily focused on from the desktop perspective. And I owned that from a technical standpoint. I had a project sponsor, um, an executive sponsor, but I led the engagement or the project from a technical perspective. And I needed to automate as much of this as possible. So I start looking at things like scripted operating system installs and automated Office installations, the Internet Explorer admin kit for Internet Explorer so we could customize it. And then one day, the TechNet CD subscription shows up on my desk. Back then, we didn't have it online. It was sent to you in this binder, and you had to put all the pages in and the CDs and all this stuff. But one of those CDs said Systems Management Server 1.2 Beta. Systems management caught my eye. And I look at this CD and I start looking at the release notes and I figure out that this is a product that does two primary functions and apparently very well. It does hardware and software inventory and software distribution. Perfect. That's exactly what I need for my project. I need to know what's out there and how quickly we're moving along with this migration. So, software and hardware inventory can give me that. And I need to be able to push out a scripted OS install and automated Office and Internet Explorer once it's been upgraded to Windows 95. So, I set up a proof of concept and within 2 or 3 weeks, get it all sorted out and figured out, and I'm off to the races playing with this. Now, unfortunately, the bank did not want to spend the $75,000 it was going to cost us in licensing to implement SMS so that I could use it fully for that project. So that got pretty much canned, but doesn't mean it didn't go on my resume. And my resume was out there on monster.com. A couple months goes by, and I get a call from this recruiter out of New York. Now, this is another lesson I want to give you guys. Recruiters get a pretty bad rep in our industry. But I will tell you, out of the three most significant career moves that I've made, it's been the direct result of working with a recruiter in that process. And remember, folks, this is a small community. Even though we're global, it's very small and people talk. So be kind to these recruiters. You don't have to be rude to them. No matter how far off the job rec from your skill set may be, remember, they're probably noobs too, and they're trying to learn, and they're not technical. So they don't necessarily know that you as an infosec person aren't really the right target for this DBA position. Um, just try to be kind to them. And remember, they can have a significant impact in your career too. So I get this call from this recruiter out of New York. And he's a typical New Yorker. I'm the Southern boy. He's talking way too fast and has this thick New Yorker accent. Sounds like he's right out of Brooklyn. And all of a sudden, he's telling me about this role, SMS admin, blah, blah, blah. Like I said, he's talking a mile a minute. And all of a sudden, he just throws out there this number, 60. I'm like, 60 what? He's like, 60K. And I say, no, I'm really happy where I'm at. Now, at that point, I was making 48. And 60K it wasn't enough for me to leave. And I meant when I said I was very happy. I loved my role. I love my team. I love my company. And I was genuinely happy. Then he says 70, 75. And then he gets to 85 and he says, that's my top out. And I sit there and I think about this. And I'm like, that's almost a $40,000 difference. There's guys on my team that don't even make that yet. So I tell them, okay, I'll meet with them. Well, sure enough, I get the job. And now I am just in awe that I'm making that kind of money and I'm doing something that I absolutely love, right? So I get this role at CNA Insurance in Nashville, managing about 3,000 endpoints with SMS. And this starts me down this career path where I have carved out yet again a niche for myself. I have a very unique skill set working with SMS, which back then was rare, but being used by all these large corporations to be able to manage their distributed endpoints and know what's out there, being able to update software and all these things, being able to meter for applications. So I'm carving out a role for myself in this industry that is also very unique. And that's one of the things that I do recommend for folks is that you find something in this field that is unique enough that you can bring a very valuable skill set to the table. It's really hard to stand out from the herd if all you're bringing is skill sets that are comparable to everybody else out there. It's hard to find what that niche is going to be for you, but when you see it, grab a hold of that thing and don't let go. I started with SMS 1.2 beta, like I said, but that carried me for the next decade of my career. It helped me launch a company, and I'll get to that here in just a second. But I start with CNA Insurance. I do that quite well for close to a year before I end up getting recruited yet again to go to Wachovia Bank in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And there I am now managing the SMS 2.0 implementation for 25,000 clients throughout the United States. One of the things that happened all during this time period between CNA Insurance and Wachovia, I wasn't that great with the SMS product at the start. And when I went into CNA Insurance, I had to know everything because I was that consultant being brought in. I was the one being paid the big dollars. I had to know that product inside and out. I couldn't be asking the customer questions about it, right? Or even questions really about their environment. And they were kind of hard asses too. So very unapproachable. But I found this website called swynk.com, SWYNK.com. Stood for Stephen Wynkoop. He's the gentleman that ran the website, still a very good friend of mine to this day, but it was a back office administrator's website, meaning all the Microsoft technologies, server technologies. And they had an SMS mail list on that website. And, if you don't know what a mail list is, it's basically a, email distribution. Everybody subscribes to the mail list. You have a question about the product, you send it out to the mail list. It goes into everybody's inbox. Anybody can respond. And when they do, everybody on the mail list gets a copy of the message, kind of like reply to all for the internet. But that mail list saved my bacon. It really did, because every time I ran into a problem, I'd post it out there and get help from other community members. Uh, I basically had to stand on the shoulders of giants in my mind. But I also had this book. I bought this SMS 1.2 Administrator's skills started getting higher and higher. And, um, you know, I was learning so much by trying to find the answer for somebody else. I was finding all these things out on my own. So a great learning experience for me. But one day I'm sitting there and I have this epiphany, so to speak. And I start a message to the mail list. And I said, we sit here day in and day out helping one another, getting, past our issues, over these hurdles. But unless it's just something we pick up, from an off topic thread or something, we know nothing more other than each other's name and email addresses. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have some kind of SMS users conference where we get together and talk about our lessons learned, compare our field notes, share experiences, that kind of thing. Maybe it could even be sponsored by swink.com. And I put in parentheses, wink, wink. Well, sure enough, Stephen Weinkoop saw that message and he pings me offline, and he and I start planning what became the first SMS users conference. And we held it in Newport Beach, California. That first conference, we had about 100 people show up. But what ended up happening is that conference grew and it continued to grow. And just a few years later, Microsoft bought the rights to that conference and it turned into the Microsoft Management Summit. And it grew and continued to grow and survived for 14 years before being rolled into TechEd and eventually into Microsoft Ignite. But under that, SMS users conference, and Microsoft Management Summit brand, it grew to over 4,000 people every year. One of Microsoft's bigger conferences. But it started with one person, one message, a community getting together and doing something. So if you're trying to find a B-sides in your area and there's not one that exists, start it yourself. Get out there, throw messages, see who else wants to get engaged, make something happen. You have that power. All it took was one person doing something. I'm not saying anything about me, just that's all it takes, one person. So that's kind of what got me to the point where I could be hired by Wachovia to manage this SMS 2.0 implementation. I just started picking up so much about this product and becoming a little bit of a subject matter expert in it. But one of the things that happened at Wachovia, and this is how I ended up starting my first company, I saw a void in the SMS product, even in the 2.0 version. There was no way to have user device affinity. There was no way to relate user information to the hardware and software inventory that we were pulling off of boxes. So we couldn't track departments or managers or cost centers, department codes, any of these kinds of things. So I developed a program. Remember that program in Logic and Design course, paying off in spades. I wrote this program that allowed companies to customize the types of data that they wanted to collect from their end users, inputting it into these fields with data normalization and rationalization on the back end. And it would tie that user input to their machine's inventory so that back in SMS, we could correlate the two and be able to have much better reporting and software targeting and all these kinds of things. So I started selling this product as a side hustle, and there's nothing wrong with having your company start from a side hustle. uh, you know that's become kind of a known nomenclature nowadays, but back then I was just running a side business, so to speak. But it helped me launch that company having a software product. But something else that I did, and what really led me to leaving Wachovia and starting my own company, was I also saw a void in the SMS installer product. And this is what pretty much every SMS customer out there was using to be able to package up software and send it out to those workstations. Microsoft, because they provided SMS installer free with the SMS licensing, they did not support it, and there was no training that existed anywhere, even though this is the product that Fortune 500 and Global 2000 companies were using worldwide to package their software and set it out to these workstations. It was essentially a scripting environment inside of a UI and no training available for it. So I developed a 2-day course and it took off like wildfire. When I announced the first course, it sold out in 24 hours, less than. I knew I was onto something then. So I started doing these public courses and having registrations through my website. And this thing, like I said, it just took off. I did not realize that it was going to take me around the world. I went to countries all over Europe, probably 30 or 40 US states, Canada. I was doing these courses everywhere and still selling the Power Myth product that I developed. So I was blending product and services in my first company and, became very successful in it. And it got to the point where, because of the SMS installer training, we also started getting contracts to build the software packages that companies wanted to push out for them. And some of them were wanting 500, 750, 1,000 applications to be packaged. I started building a team and, this company grew and grew, but I wasn't prepared. I didn't have forecasting. I didn't do tabletop exercises of what if scenarios. And when 9/11 happened, the carpet got ripped out from underneath my feet and I fell flat on my face. I wasn't prepared for the economic impact. Uh, I had multi-million dollar projects just pulled off of the tables. And, you know, it gutted me, y'all. It really did. But it also humbled me, and I needed that humbling. I grew way too fast, way too quickly, and I forgot humility in the process. You have to remember, I was still pretty young back then. And my success, I attributed to myself and myself alone. I forgot all the people that helped me in the beginning. I forgot about Dave Reagan. I forgot about that SMS mail list. I forgot about the guys like Rod Trent, Paul Thompson, Stephen Wynkoop, Ian Turner, all these guys that helped me so tremendously early in my career. I forgot to give back. I forgot to give thanks to the man above because I was living somebody else's life. Remember where I was supposed to be, prison or a grave. So that humility, it hurt, but I needed it. And it eventually meant me having to go back to work as an FTE employee working for another company after laying off one guy at a time over the next 18, 24 months after 9/11. So I get recruited again. Remember those recruiters, to go to work for a company down in Austin, Texas called Collective Technologies. And that changed my life. It really did. My CEO there was a gentleman named Ed Taylor. And, Ed kind of took me under his wing. I went in there as a first systems management consultant working for a company of about 250 consultants. And we were building out an SMS and Microsoft Operations Manager practice. And I was the first employee. And eventually, after about 6 months, I grew the team to another 4 guys, and he gave me the practice as the practice manager. And he taught me a lot. He taught me to know my numbers, to know about P&Ls and utilization metrics and weighted margins. He really took me under his wing, and he became my mentor, and I was his mentee. And unfortunately, we lost Ed a few years ago, and I didn't just lose my mentor; I lost a friend. But he saw something in me, and I so valued the mentorship that he provided me. And that's something else that I highly recommend to everybody out there. I don't care where you're at in your career, have a mentor, have someone who's going to hold you accountable, but also give you the guidance and steer you in the right direction, not just professionally, but also in life. Um, Ed was that person for me, and I miss him dearly. But I do have other mentors in my life now, and I have mentees. And that's the other thing that is kind of required. If you're going to take up a mentor's time, eventually you got to give that back and help the next generation coming up behind us. And, I have a couple of folks that I mentor right now, but let me tell you something. I get so much more out of that experience than I think I ever give them. But I'm blessed for those relationships. And I'm so grateful to have those folks in my life. So while I was at Collective Technologies, that's when I picked up my first security certification, my CISP, CISSP. And I took Sean Harris's book, peeled that thing apart. I had a set of DVDs that I watched every single day. I pretty much ate, drank, and slept that CISP for 2-3 months. I don't recommend that for folks. You need work-life balance. But I was so hungry back then, and I wanted to make damn sure that I got that cert, and that I passed it the first time because it was pretty expensive. I think 600 back then. And this was back when it was pen or pencil and paper and the 10 domains of the CISP. But I knew when that letter arrived and it said my first and last name, comma, CISSP, I didn't even have to open the envelope. I passed that thing and I passed it on my first go. And I was shocked because I walked out of that place thinking there is no way in hell that I passed this exam. It was just like that GED all over again. So when I left CT, Collective Technologies, I was recruited again to Ireland to build a practice in Dublin. And it was a hell of an experience. Being able to live in a foreign country, different culture, different foods, different music, different accents, the whole thing. It was such a phenomenal experience. And it was scary as hell. I had to sell everything I owned, take 5 duffel bags over there with me, and start over from scratch, not knowing if I would succeed or fall on my face again. But you have to take risks sometimes, and it can be scary, but it can also be an amazing experience. So don't be afraid to take those risks. Unfortunately, it wasn't necessarily a failure on my part, but because the Celtic tiger was coming to an end, their economy started to tank, and I basically had to come back to the States because it just wasn't going to happen. There was not enough sales and not enough opportunities for us to be able to do anything. So when I came back to the States, I knew I wanted to be in security and focus on it exclusively. So I found a company called Secure Branch Technologies, SVT, that it was just the perfect fit because it allowed me to get into security, but also stay true to that system center or the SECM and MOM background, right? Their product provided compliance automation for all the Microsoft server products and rationalizing that back to GRC controls, governance, risk, and compliance. And it was a perfect fit for me to be able to take all my skill sets in systems management, but also these new skills that I was developing around security and focus on that. I was also able to get my first real hands-on experience doing things like marketing and product development and management, building a global partner network. So I'm taking the foundation that Ed Taylor gave me at CT and what I was able to replicate in Ireland and bringing that back inside of this security company and starting to build something there. So I was really grateful for that experience, and it ended up leading me to Heat Software, where I became the director of the patch management product that they provide that plugs into WSUS and SCCM to be able to provide third-party patching using the exact same process and technologies that organizations use today with WSUS and SCCM for patching Microsoft products, right? Except now all the third-party products on top of it. But I own that product soup to nuts. And our investors, Clear Lake Capital, also owned Landesk. And they, because Heat Software had about a 2-year jump on Landesk as far as cloud-enabled service management, they wanted to bring the two companies together and build on that story, right? So in the new organization, I became the security principal engineer. It was basically a fellow, a technology fellow in the company. And I had 5 dotted lines of responsibility where I, again, was doing product management, marketing, channels, sales engineering, and services. All these things relate to building a company and everything that you need to know in being a leader in an organization around cybersecurity. I need to know how to develop product, but I also need to know how to develop service, how to market and sell that, how to support it, and how to keep that product relevant through updates and whatnot. So building all the way back to my side hustle with Wachovia, I'm still doing these things today and continuing to develop those skills. I knew I was going to leave the new company Avanti, and I started preparing myself. So I sat for another certification. Keep those certs relevant, keep updating your skill sets, keep those certs renewed, because if you are planning to start your own company or lead another organization, your customers are going to want to see that you have certified folks. You may be partnering with other technology companies that those certifications are a requirement of the partner agreements. So I sat for the Sec Plus just to see how it compared to this CIS. Passed it. It was an interesting experience. But I also registered myself with Harvard University for their cybersecurity risk management program. 5 months long, grueling, a lot of 3 and 4 a.m. nights writing papers and whatnot, but it was a tremendous experience. And that Harvard University looks really good on a resume or, a profile. So, lesson there, and I know we're wrapping up here on time, but keep your skill sets relevant, keep those certifications, keep educating yourself by whatever means. And there's tons of in-person, online, self-study, ways to keep your education relevant and timely with the industry. So with that, folks, I'm going to wrap things up here. I just want to, say, in closing, don't be afraid to reverse engineer that shit. Whatever it takes to be able to get yourself learning, doing things. If you have to stand on the shoulders of giants and learn from whatever it is they're crafting, reverse engineer that, make it your own. Don't be afraid to take that short-term investment in yourself as well. Keep creating, keep learning, find your mentor, and remember to give back with your mentees. But lastly, don't listen to those voices in your head that tell you that you're not good enough for this stuff. It's too risky. You'll fail. Just trust in the process. Give it a go. The worst thing that happens is that carpet gets ripped out from underneath your feet and you get to start all over and reinvent yourself. So I hope this has been useful to some of y'all and look forward to connecting with you. I'll put my contact info up here on the screen again. I am infosec war on Twitter. You can also find me on LinkedIn and connect there as well.